I'm from India. This happened in one of the southern states there, back in 2012. We were all staying at my grandma's place for summer vacation, as we're plantation owners. We have areca nuts, mostly, some coconut, coffee, and cocoa too. The thing about plantations that you'll find is that they are extremely secluded, apart from neighbouring plantations, which are still a fair distance away. The nearest city is a 45-minute drive on any vehicle via a dirt road. There are no street lights whatsoever, so you better know your way. My grandma lives out there with my eldest maternal uncle and his family, and they usually walk around at night with no fear whatsoever, which is something that I would never do. I'm a bit scared of the dark. So during vacations, we all gathered at this plantation for a get-together. Now this includes our family, 2 of my mum's sisters and their families, and 2 of her brothers and their families. 6 siblings in total. We get there early, like 9 AM or so, and my aunt and their families are there a few days before us. Me being the eldest guy, I get pampered a lot because I have some badass elder sisters, and yet again, come off as a bit of a scaredy cat in comparison to them. Even my youngest 7-year-old cousin. She's absolutely fearless. But back to the story. So we all got there by 7 PM, except my youngest uncle, who was unmarried at the time. He's the only one who prefers the city to the plantation, and despite being religious, doesn't really participate in many of the activities. He's the only one to refuse to do a special rite of passage within our traditions. Maybe I'll talk about that another time. In their generation of about 14 guys in total, back in the day, it was a big deal. He lives in a major city which is a good 4-hour drive from the plantation, and to avoid traffic decided to drive in the evening and get here by 11 or so, which was a very bad idea. So we started driving at 8 PM from the house. We had an outdoor barbecue going around that time, but when 10 rolled around we were all getting quite tired, so decided to call it a night and figured he would just arrive whenever he did. We never lock the doors here because we have 6 huge dogs who we are more than confident guard the place perfectly adequately. Now, it's getting late, and they are small slopes and drops that lead to the front of our house. And it can be tough even for locals on the dirt road. So as you can imagine, taking these roads at night can be a little bit tricky. We all fall asleep, and then 1 AM rolls around and our dogs start barking, which is rare, because they're never together once we take them off their leashes for the night. So naturally we awoke, figuring that my uncle was home. We love him, because he's really cool. And so we peep out the window, and we're all sharing a huge room by the way, and we see that his car is stuck on the slope, and 2 of the dogs are circling the car with their tails tucked between their legs. That was all we thought. That is when we heard the howling. Loud and sharp. I remember my nuts crawling to my throat. It was one of the dogs who was at the door, howling, facing the door. At first, we thought our uncle had probably accidentally run over one of the dogs, which would have been terrible enough. But no, all of this happened in a matter of seconds. But it was so much to take in that it felt longer. Then our grandma and my eldest uncle opened the front door, and the dog howling at the door bolted at the car. At this point, 5 dogs were circling the car, sniffing and growling and God knows what. There was still a good 20 to 30 feet distance between the car and the house, so my grandma called out to Mama, asking him to park, and that the dogs wouldn't do anything, figuring he's scared of them. My uncle didn't respond. The car was dead. The only light was coming from the house, so my eldest uncle started walking towards the car, and thought perhaps he was having car trouble or something. So before he could reach halfway, my uncle opened the car door, but not the driver end, the rear one, like he wasn't driving at all, and started walking towards the house. We all thought it was weird for a second. Maybe he was just trying to be cool and pull a prank, but then he walked past the eldest uncle like he didn't even see him, same with Grandma. At this point, we're all getting worried. So we cousins walk down and get a glimpse of our uncle before he dashes for the temple room inside the house. He looked so pale. His eyes were bloodshot, and we got scared, thinking he was drunk and that he drove here in that state. Then it hit the fan. One of the dogs ran inside the house. The remaining were all outside, looking very, very nervous and whining and not wanting to get in. My grandma and eldest uncle came in shortly after. By this point, everyone in the house was awake, and we kids were told to get back upstairs. But obviously we were way too close to pissing ourselves to even move. And then we heard this laughing. My youngest uncle was laughing in this deep voice that almost seemed demonic. I remember gripping my sister's arm and whimpering worse than the dogs when I heard it. For a second, every fearful memory seemed to crawl all over me, and all I wanted to do was to get up in a ball and cry. It seemed that was the general consensus among everyone who heard the laugh. My grandma approached my uncle, and he shot her this nasty look, and then started speaking in ancient Tulu, a South Indian language dialect. I couldn't understand a word of it, but my grandma did, and she just sobbed and yelled back at him. At this point, most of my cousins and aunts were in tears, and then my uncle started walking back to the door, saying something again in the strange dialect. At that point, my eldest uncle and my aunt's husband tackled and restrained him. He was then at the foot of the stairs between us and the adults. Keep in mind, these are big guys and strong, and one of them was a commander in the army, and the other one a pro kabaddi player. And my eldest uncle can hold his own. He's 6'2" and well built, and between the three of them, it took all their combined strength to hold down a skinny 5'10" guy. My middle uncle, who seemed to be missing during the whole commotion, rushed in with a dude from a nearing plantation, a relative of ours. He's like my grandfather's cousin or something, but he's our uncle's age. He's a priest in our community. So he came in, and they all went to the temple room, grabbed the ceremonial kalash and a sword, and the tirith, which is like holy water, and I kid you not, he started talking to Mama in the same dialect. He then touched the hilt of the sword to his forehead and started chanting. My uncle thrashed and throbbed like he was, well, possessed, and then he emptied the holy water on his head. My uncle went limp and fell to the floor. He started seizing up, and my uncles turned him on his side. He was dazed as hell, started crying, and then threw up all over the floor. My grandma was stunned and crying in a chair. Everyone was in tears. The dogs refused to leave, and the rest were at the doorstep. My aunt tried to shoo them away, but they didn't budge. The priest insisted we let them stay. They saved his uncle's life. Then we heard this thump outside. We were too scared to move, but the commander uncle went outside. The car that was stuck on the slope had rolled down and bumped against the house. The priest went out and did the same swordy thing to the car. Instead of the hilt, he used the blade and asked no one to approach it until sunrise. It was around 1 a.m. at that point. Everyone was too messed up to go back to sleep, and the house smelled like puke, wet dog, and, scarily, of smoke. My uncle had passed out. We kids were all huddled up in the hall, and the adults were all talking. One of my uncles was keeping watch on the uncle who was in the other room. I can't remember when I fell asleep. I don't remember dreaming or anything, and honestly, when I woke up, I was thinking that this was all just a dream. In the morning at 7 or so, my uncles decided to move the car to the garage, and that's when we saw it. A faint red handprint on the windshield. The spooky part, it was on the inside of the driver's side. Oh, and that dialect? I pestered my eldest cousin for days, and she finally translated it for me. The thing he kept repeating over and over was, "I'm going to take your son to where you won't find what's left of him." My family is Russian. Both my parents are from Siberia in the northern part of Russia and were born in a city called Omsk. Anyway, A few days ago, my dad and I got into a conversation that kept deviating from the original topic, and eventually reached a point where we started talking about paranormal occurrences in our lives. I asked him why he believes in Yetis, as a long time ago he told me that he believed in them but never explained why. My dad is not the type of guy who believes in paranormal activity. He believes ghosts and aliens are all far-fetched nonsense, and it was very much to my surprise that he openly believes in Yetis, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you call it. He sits up straight, clears his throat, and then tells me the following story. My dad is 51 years old, and in his 20s, he was serving time in the military. He was in a place called Sputnik, a village close to the Russian border with Norway. If you look it up, you can still see the barracks and the whole military camp itself. Pretty fascinating. All heavy-duty military supplies were always stored far away from any human activity, typically in a forest. One day, a group of 10 people, one of whom is my father, were tasked to go on an expedition to the warehouse to restock military supplies in the camp. This required many people because loading up the trucks with very heavy equipment and ammunition was a rather grueling task. My father gets in the truck with the others and they're on the road. They reach the place far later than anticipated because of something along the lines of, "We got a flat tire." The place they were going to was located near a city that's on the bank of one of the hundreds of rivers you can see if you look on a map. The place was called Lovazero. They get there during the night. The only thing that was illuminating the forest were the stars, since it was so dark and everyone was so tired that they decided to do a little sleepover in the warehouse. They slept over at a dugout not too far away. Once they get there, everyone takes their spot on the floor and says goodnight. But no matter how much my dad was tired, he simply couldn't sleep. He stayed up for another 30 minutes before standing up and seeing everyone with their eyes open. No one was asleep either. He had thought he was the only one awake, but he wasn't. The thing that was keeping him up was a sense of discomfort that he couldn't explain, and he decided to share this with the others. Everyone nods and says that they were all experiencing the exact same thing, and that it wouldn't let them rest peacefully. After another half hour, the discomfort has now evolved into mild fear and panic. At this point, everyone is really concerned because they've all got to wake up early tomorrow to move heavy boxes, and sleeping of course is essential. They keep laying in silence when all of a sudden they hear a very strong thump on the roof of the building. The thumping persists, and it sounds as if someone extremely heavy is walking on the roof. Now, this roof was wooden. It was a sod roof with grass covering it, and my dad could tell for a fact it was someone walking because of the creaking that the boards made. Simultaneously, everyone, as discovered the next day, begins hyperventilating, and everyone's heart begins beating extremely fast. The thumping this creature was making was so loud it resonated in my dad's ears, and he felt his inside shake. One of the guys passed out. At a certain point, the creature descends from the roof and starts walking around the dugout, and one of the guys that was proud enough to open his eyes looked around and said that the creature was peeking in, but since it was dark he could only see a silhouette. Eventually, what it was that caused all of this left, and everyone tried to go back to sleep. The next day, one of my dad's buddies asked a passing local about this phenomenon, and he said it was completely in the ordinary, and even gave it a specific name, which, unfortunately, my dad does not remember. Also, consider the fact that this all happened during the times of the Soviet Union. As you may or may not know, the Soviet Union was a complete atheist state. No cults, no belief in spirits, no religion. And people who believed in that sort of stuff were frowned upon. My father and the 9 other soldiers are ideologically packed elite troops, and honestly, hearing this from him sounded crazy, and I know for a fact it was real. This is my first time sharing any experience online that happened to myself or anyone else. It was early summer of 2010, which I only remember because my 21st birthday had just passed and I was finally legal to hit the bars. It was a Friday night, and I was up having a drink at a bar that my cousin David was the bartender at. It was a small town bar that outside any events like a band or other entertainment being there, it usually just stayed pretty quiet. It was very early in the evening, and I had just gotten out of work for the night, working at a McDonald's in another small town, less than 10 miles from the one in which I lived. I was only on my second drink of the evening when my phone rang. On the other line was a friend of mine from my childhood, James. He was calling asking if I wanted to come over to his brother's house and join them for a night of poker, beer and weed. Sounded like a good time in my book, and since I was literally only on my first sip in my second gin and tonic, I agreed to make the drive into Toledo. Most people know where Toledo is, but for those of you who don't, it's a city in the northwest region of Ohio, about an hour south from Detroit. It was about a 20-minute drive from my small town, and I figured it would be a good time. I stopped at home to grab some cash. I only ever took about $10 to $20 with me, just to make sure I didn't get too caught up having a good time. I left the house at 11:05, and remember this distinctly because I had called James to tell him I was on my way, and they were going to wait for me to start the poker game at 11:30. We always played a tournament style of poker game, where we put all our money in at once and got equal amount of chips, and played until there was only one person left with any chips, who then got to keep all of the money. I took my usual route over to his brother Eddie's house, as I have done many times before. We had all gotten together, a group anywhere between 4 to 6 of us, and would play poker in Eddie's basement at least twice a month. I had gotten into the corner of Oakdale Street in East Broadway, and I was sitting at a red light in an area that's nothing but residential housing outside of the elementary school that sat at that exact corner. I'm sitting up looking at the red light, waiting for it to change, which always seemed to take forever coming from this direction, when I noticed something in the sky that from my vantage point was partially hidden directly behind the red light. It was a very bright white light that seemed to be pointing straight down, almost like it was a helicopter using a spotlight to identify something, but much, much brighter at the point of origin. I heard absolutely nothing after rolling my windows down, and knew this could not possibly be a helicopter, or I'd absolutely be able to hear it. Wanting a better view, I pulled into the parking lot of an ice cream shop that sat directly across the road from the school. I was nearby it, and got out my car to try and figure out what this thing was. When I got out of the car, I stared up into the sky and immediately found it again. It couldn't have been a plane. It didn't have the right shape. It was more oval than anything. But it was definitely an oval shape. I almost thought perhaps it was a blimp given the shape, but it seemed far too large to be a blimp, even by the measurements of some. Everyone knows, like the Goodyear blimp. Plus it had no decals or identifying marks, either silver or greyish. After what felt like looking at it for 30 seconds or so, my eyes started to burn. Not burn like in the sense of extreme burning, but it was almost like flies were coming into my eyes and making them water up. I closed my eyes and rubbed them. They were closed, and all I see was black. And after getting my eyes to stop bothering me, I tried to look up again to find it, but it's gone. I looked all around but couldn't see it anymore. This, you see, is a very densely populated neighborhood with houses, trees, and They're able to obscure things from view if you look up into the sky. And after a little than a minute, I decided that I should probably go and play poker. I get over to Eddie's house, which is about 4 blocks from where this had taken place, and knock on the basement door. A few moments go by, and no one answers. I go to the front door and knock. I figured maybe, since I'm 5 to 10 minutes late, maybe they were upstairs playing on the PS3. I knock, but there's no answer. Finally, I start knocking very loudly on the door, almost pounding, and Eddie finally answers the door saying, "Man, why the hell are you this late, knocking on my door at night?" I looked at him, confused. "Well, your brother said I could come over and play cards with you guys." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity and responds, "Yeah, I know he did. He called you like 6 hours ago. It's 4:30 in the morning. How late did you think we would be playing to?" This scared me quite a bit, as from what I had remembered, at this moment it could not possibly have been any later than 11:25 to 11:30 at most. I attempted to play it off and say, "Damn man, must have lost track of time. Can I use your bathroom before I head back?" He agrees and tells me I should splash some water on my face, as I look like I'm either drunk or haven't slept in a week. I walk into his bathroom and my eyes are absolutely bloodshot. It almost looks like I have 2 black eyes. To this day, I have absolutely no idea what happened to me that night. I have no explanation for the lost hours worth of time. How I could not have possibly noticed that much time being passed, or how on earth something that felt like my eyes were being irritated by a mosquito or something similar falling into my eyes. I don't want to pretend to know what it was and explain it, or even assume that whatever it was I saw that evening had anything to do with it, but it has creeped me out ever since. I am from Eastern Europe. I'm going to share with you a story that my grandparents and mother used to talk about. My great-grandfather went to the forest to pick some wood. He went there during the night, since it was illegal to take wood from the forest. By chance, he met another man from the village who was doing the same thing. They agreed to stick together. A little time passed when they saw a small billy goat. Its fur was black. My great-grandfather assumed that someone had lost it. So they decided to take the billy goat with them in order to share its meal later. They put the billy goat in a sack, and then weird stuff began to happen. The sack became heavier and heavier, and they often exchanged it between them. At some point, the billy goat was so agitated that my great-grandfather said, "Take it easy, billy goat." The paranormal thing is that the billy goat repeated the exact same words in a weird voice. My great-grandfather had a gun and shot the sack twice. There was nothing but thin air. They were convinced it was the devil, since they had in mind to steal wood. I have some friends near Shiprock that are big into researching about Bigfoot and skinwalkers. They've been featured in shows like Finding Bigfoot, Coast to Coast AM, and countless podcasts that speak about the paranormal, and on several History Channel programs. These people are the real deal. A few years ago, my wife and I were on a vacation, and part of our trip would be driving through their town. Taking advantage of this opportunity, we decided to spend a few nights out there and hang out with them. We met up, went to dinner, and talked about our personal paranormal experiences and recent Bigfoot or skinwalker sightings. I wanted to experience searching for skinwalker evidence for myself, so during the course of our conversation, I asked if they were willing to take me out on the field the following night and search for the elusive creatures. Being that most of them are Native American, they were very hesitant, and only one of them agreed to it. The rest of the group decided to meet us on my last night there to take me to Sasquatch instead. The following day, my friend arrived to the hotel and picked me up at 5 p.m. We must have driven for about an hour and a half out of town, mostly through dirt roads to a place locally known to have a lot of skinwalker activity. By the time we reached the location, everything was dark. He shuts the trick off, and like in most paranormal investigations, we sit and wait, trying to listen for anything out of the ordinary. For the most part, it was quiet. Other than a bunch of annoying crickets making noises, nothing much happens. My buddy told me about recent sightings and his own encounters with these medicine men. Long story short, after about an hour, he told me to get out of the truck, walk outside, and towards the front of it to try and listen out for anything. He said that if anything happened, he would immediately turn the lights on and light up whatever might be there. Basically, he wanted me to be human skinwalker bait. I was hesitant for a moment, but since I had a weapon on me, I thought it to be okay. But I also knew that bullets would not do much to a skinwalker. Just as I had made my decision to get out of his truck, the night turned ever darker. This wasn't a regular dark night type of dark. This darkness had a purpose to it. It felt extremely ominous. It also got extremely cold, and we both noted that all the little critters had suddenly gone quiet. After hesitating for a while, I decided to open the truck doors to get out, but as I did, and had my foot ready to touch the ground, we heard a loud whistle. It wasn't a distant whistle, like the air brings towards you. This was next to us. It sounded like it was inside the cab of a truck. Obviously, I thought someone had snuck up on us or that my buddy was trying to mess with me. But when I looked at him, he had turned white. The expression on his face had totally changed, seeing that he was afraid. That naturally put me on high alert. I tried to snap him out of it, but he seemed frozen in place. The whistling continued for a few times, and I was screaming at my friend at this point. Eventually he came to his senses and began to react to what was happening around us. He then immediately turned his truck on. We grabbed our flashlight and looked all over the place to see what the hell was out there, but of course we found no one. Feeling nervous, and him being native, we decided to leave the place right away. The next day, him and a few other friends picked me up again and took me out at night to search for Bigfoot near Shipwalk Mountain. While investigating, we found what's known in the field as a Bigfoot nest. Inside the nest were tons of dried out eaten animals, carcasses and bones, mostly deer. As we're trying to figure out what lived there, we suddenly heard a loud yelp. It wasn't a coyote or mountain lion type of yelp. This is the yelp you felt in your bones. You could feel the vibration in your chest. Of course, we all started searching around to see what it was. I didn't see anything, but two of my partners saw something move up on the ridge. They were scared enough to draw and cock their weapons, and about 10 minutes later, we began to hear several footsteps all around us. We couldn't see who or what it was because it was really dark, even with our flashlights turned on. After hearing these footsteps getting closer and closer, and less afraid of us, we ended up leaving the area hastily. These are my personal experiences and they're all true. I don't expect many people to believe me. My late friend, JC Johnson, and I talked many times about what happened. I'm still in contact with everyone who took me out on those nights. I still go out to the field here in Nevada, trying to see if I can catch anything. I was driving home one night under a new moon February sky. Not a single cloud, and the Milky Way was gorgeous. I had been driving for a while, as it was an hour-and-a-half trip, when I noticed something odd in the sky. A void, something blocking the stars. This was odd because, 1, it was in the opposite direction of the moon's position. 2, it was large, and big enough that I could see its triangular outline. 2 long sides, 1 shorter. At first, I dismissed it as a cloud, nothing abnormal. But its outline was 3 straight lines, not natural. Once I realized this, I kinda got nervous. As I kept driving, I estimated it to be under 1 kilometer off the ground and hovering in place. I was starting to get closer to it, with the road I was on seeming to pass underneath it. With my brain going into full X-Files mode, I started to feel jittery, as my brain was trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Before I got underneath it, despite my brain telling me to get away, I pulled over and got out to see it better. This was in 2005, before I had a cell phone. So I stood there in the dark in the middle of nowhere, staring at a big wedge in the sky. No wind, no noise, just calm and quiet. And after about a minute of standing there, it seemed to start moving, almost spinning in place, the long front moving around toward where I was standing. I started to panic a bit, realizing that I might have really messed up when the UFO lit up several lights under it and they began pulsing, almost like the blinkers at a crosswalk. The lights flashed in yellow, blue, green, then instantaneously there was a muffled whomp and it was gone. The obscured stars were now visible, and a slight breeze kicked up. Needless to say, I got back in my car, drove like crazy to get home, and had a double shot of whiskey and was up all night. I've replayed this in my head and analysed every possible explanation, but there is only one, and I'll go to my grave knowing that aliens exist. This was told to me by my dad. First and foremost, my dad was not a believer in aliens, ghosts, Bigfoot, or portals, but he couldn't explain this away. My dad was a raccoon hunter. He owned several dogs and had many friends that also hunted with him. This happened in the 60s. He said one night him and a buddy of his took their dogs on a late night run. There was a small conservation area about 5 miles from our house with picnic tables and primitive campsites. A natural spring runs through the area and it's just a beautiful place. He said they let their dogs out and were sitting on the tailgate of the truck listening to them run. He said that they managed to get a raccoon in a tree and hid. Him and his buddy walked to where they were. The dogs were highly trained to stay at the tree and not leave until he arrived. He said the dogs got leashed up and were waiting for the truck when the dogs started whining and whimpering, acting completely out of character. His big male hound cowered down and took off, breaking the hold my dad had on him. He said they heard a noise like nothing either of them had ever heard before. Mind you, these 2 men had been in the Missouri woods all their lives. He said it was a growing noise and they could hear footsteps circling them. They both had headlights on and both of them tried to see whatever it was, but kept it out the light. He said it started chattering like to itself. He took out a firearm, one that he carries, and shot it into the air a few times, and the stalking and chattering just stopped. He then said they took the dogs and quickly made their way back to the truck. My dad's old male dog was there waiting for them. He said the dogs were acting so strangely, cowering and trembling. They got their dogs loaded up, and when they checked the time, over 2 hours were missing. He said the trees the dogs were at weren't very far from the truck, so walking to them, getting the dogs, and back to the truck would have been at least half hour at most. He said they never discussed it with anyone but each other. He didn't tell me until I was grown. After he passed, I asked my mum if he told her, and she said the night it happened, and he was scared. My dad was never scared of anything, but that he couldn't explain. He was pale just telling me the story. He said they were stalked by something with heavy footsteps that chattered to itself. This was in the summer, late at night. I am a healthcare professional working at a small hospital in a rural area of the Midwest in the USA. It's not unusual for me to see 6 to 8 patients a day. Occasionally, you run into a patient who you really hit it off with, where it seems as if you've known each other for years. That's how my story starts. At my hospital, we have what is called the Joint Program for patients who are having elective hip or knee replacements done. I was scheduled to see this lady, Doris, for the last time before she discharged home, later that same date. As I've said, Doris and I really hit it off. In the process of helping her prepare to head home, I asked her what made her finally decide to get her knee replacement done. She explained that she had been to her doctor many times for knee pain, and she finally decided to follow his suggestion. After that, they found what she described as little beads around her knee in her x-ray, likely bone cartilage. I teased her by saying, "Oh, the aliens just put them in there." Doris didn't miss a beat. She told me that she wanted to show me something and asked me to grab her iPad for her. After doing so, she pulls up pictures of some of her cattle. Her and her husband are cattle ranchers in the area, and there are tons of cattle ranches in a 50-mile radius where I live that have been mutilated in the very same way you see on the alien TV shows, documentaries, and so on. I'm talking patches of skin taken out in perfect circles around the eyes, missing tongue, desiccated insides with perfect hide, missing rectum/udders, no blood, all of that. I was honestly too shocked to speak much at first. I asked Doris who or what she thought was doing it. She stated she had absolutely no idea, but that she was sure it wasn't the government because they could easily come to any cattle auction and buy cattle, and no one would ever be any the wiser. She said she thought it was an intimidation tactic to leave the cattle behind, like that had to be found the next day. She also said that it seemed like they rotate around the cattle ranches every year or so. Her ranch will go a few years unmolested while her neighbors will have problems. Also, she stated that it always seemed to occur on what she called those weird holidays, by which I guess she means equinoxes, solstices, and so on. She said that sometimes her husband will hear a loud whooshing wind sound above his head. Anyway, that's pretty much it. This happened 2 years ago now, and it's been in my mind ever since. It's creepy to think about these kind of things happening, just half hour away from where I lie my head every night. When I was really young, probably about 5 or 6, my family went camping at the tippy top of the mountain. You really couldn't get higher on said mountain. There was a lake, and we were camping next to it. So of course my family was fishing. My dad and my mum, my uncle and I were on the shore trying to get some fish. Across the shore on the other side of the small lake, my dad had noticed a huge brown and black humanoid figure, just standing still and facing right at us. It had to have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller, since it was so far away. So like any human would naturally do, my dad tried yelling at it, since he had thought it was a prank of some sorts. I don't remember what my dad said, but I remember the sound of the creature, the one that it made back. It wasn't anything we understood. We just kind of stood there. It was screaming unintelligibly. It did, however, sound like it knew what it was trying to say, like it was trying to communicate with us in its own language. Then the creature took off fast. Mind you, the entire time he'd been on 2 feet like a human. He turned and began running towards the forest and was out of sight in seconds. He had to have been running at least 25 to 30 miles per hour. My brother, grandpa, and dog tried chasing it, which was definitely the smart thing to do, and went to where we had seen him at the direction he left in. They did find a huge lump of black hair that was stuck in a barbed wire fence, although I'm not certain if it was from that creature. Tell me why we didn't leave. We still spent the night in the tents. It was very windy and I don't think anyone slept. I think about it from time to time, but it honestly isn't that rare of an encounter here in Utah. I've seen UFOs, and my siblings claim to have seen skinwalkers. I promise, my family is not a bunch of kooks. This is a small piece of the entire story, and I swear it's true. I woke up one night and checked my phone to see if my son had texted me goodnight. He has done this every day for years. I looked over and noted that it was 2:20 a.m. I put my phone away and stared up at the ceiling, lying on my back, waiting for sleep. My wife was beside me, spooning my side, with her back to the only window in the room, which was about 20 feet from her, to my right. About 10 feet to my left was a walk-in closet and bathroom. Both doors were closed. Behind my head was the headboard and outside wall. My feet extended out towards our other bathroom wall. Our bedroom door was closed as usual, and our only window, which opens to the parking lot 3 floors below, was mostly blocked with a blackout shade and decorative curtains. A small amount of light from a street light just outside crept into the room and gave the black shade an almost vague orange glow. As I stared up at the ceiling attempting to fall asleep, I noticed that the air in the room felt thick, like static on a TV, and I could see tiny bits of light flickering all over my peripheral. There seemed to be a noise in the background like TV static, and I assumed it was my imagination, but I began to feel very, very scared. I attempted to close my eyes, but the scary feeling turned into a danger feeling. I turned to my right to wake up my wife, as she usually comforts me when I have issues of this kind, when I noticed a large figure standing in front of the window, partially behind the curtain, and my fight or flight instantly kicked in. I felt imminent danger, but at the same time, it didn't feel possible. So I closed my eyes tightly and reopened them. The figure immediately took a sidestep to its left, and now I could see the whole thing in its entirety. It was big and dark, possibly shiny. It was very tall, had long arms, and I swear it had horns. It was totally silent. The static shh sound was all that I could hear. I knew it wasn't possible, but I was in total panic. My body was telling me to run. I blinked. It had moved closer. I began shaking my wife and screaming her name over and over, and each time I looked up at the thing, it was closer than before. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't wake up. I shook her harder and harder, yelling at her as loud as I could, practically screaming her name, and fighting the urge to run, but knowing that if she didn't wake up immediately, something horrible and violent was going to happen. The last time I looked up, it was towering over us only a few steps away, and I couldn't catch my breath. And then she was holding me, and her bedside lamp was on, and everything was totally quiet. She told me I had been screaming in my sleep, screaming loudly like she'd never heard before. She says that she couldn't wake me, that I just screamed and tried to fight her off. I was almost crying. That was one of the worst events I'd ever had, and it absolutely terrified me. I know most of you are going to say it was a dream or sleep paralysis or perhaps a night terror, but to me it was real. It occurred at a time in my life where strange and unexplained things were happening to me frequently. Long story short, Over a 6-year-ish period in my life, something was trying to make me end my own life. Something was slowly affecting every aspect of my life, playing the long game. During this time, I had regular paranormal experiences. I lost my high-paying career, lost my house, both my cars, nearly all my possessions, and became estranged from my son, my parents, and all my loved ones. Eventually, I got a divorce, was charged with crimes I didn't commit, and was faced with more hardship and depression than I thought that I could possibly survive. This is not a story of how I found Jesus, although I have always been a Christian, but I do believe this could have been demonic. I have read true accounts of others who have been led to near taking their life over a long period of time by something malevolent. I'm glad to say that many years later, everything ended up working out. The first incident happened when I was 11 years old, in 1989. We had just moved to a very hot state from a very cold one, and it was a few weeks into the school year. My stepfather at the time was a cheap arse, so he wouldn't turn on our air conditioning, so we had our windows open at night. It being roughly 85 Fahrenheit at night, so it was very hot. I could see my windows from where my bed was. It had vertical blinds over it which were closed, but the window was open. I woke up at some point in the night, seeing light shining through the blinds and hearing a radio or some kind of chatter. I couldn't understand the words being spoken, but it sounded like people talking. I thought the neighbors were throwing a party, which is weird for a weekday around 3 a.m. So I tried to ignore it and go back to bed. Maybe an hour later, it's dark again in my room. I woke up and looked to my side and saw what everyone describes as a typical grey alien, about 3-ish feet tall with big black eyes. It was terrifying. It turned to face me as I noticed it. It looked like stop motion, how it was so slow and jerky. As it faced me, I threw my blanket over my head, tucked in all of my limbs under it and crossed my legs so that none of me was exposed and began praying. I've never been a religious person, but I didn't know what to do. I asked to every deity I was aware of, Jesus, Allah, Buddha, anything I could do to please protect me and make it go away. I remember how terrified I was, my heart pounding in my chest. It was so hot under those blankets that I could barely breathe, but I was too scared to move for what felt like hours. I didn't exactly know what time it was or how long I lay there, but I stayed there, too scared to move, praying until the sun came up, and my alarm for school went off. Since that day, I've slept with my head under the covers every night, until I was an adult, and even now I sometimes do. Soon after that, I was diagnosed with an incurable, yet manageable autoimmune disease. Not that they were related incidents, but I feel like it's relevant to mention. In my search for answers, I saw a psychic once, who was positive I was full of crap. She said that their appearance was related to my illness, but I'm fairly sure she didn't know what she was talking about. A few years ago, I got hypnotized and EMDR done, related to these memories. Out of the hypnosis, I remembered that there were 3 of them, 1 in my room and 2 outside my window. The hypnosis also brought up a memory of a different night in the same house, where I was getting a drink in the kitchen late at night. The idea was conveyed that they were hiding under the kitchen table, and they were or are always around, watching. I don't like saying the word alien because I'm not sure what they are. They also didn't look exactly the same way they're depicted. They don't look organic or fleshy. They look very angular and sharp. 99% of the pictures that you see online are fake. At least they don't look like what I've seen. I saw one picture taken in the dark next to a car where you can see one off in the distance illuminated by flash. But that's the only time I've ever seen media of it potentially looking like what I saw. The therapist that did the hypnosis thought I had some kind of abuse, and that's where the PTSD came from. But no matter how hard she poked at the idea, it never panned out. I don't think that ever happened to me, as in it doesn't explain the other memories that happened way later when we moved out of that house and away from my stepfather, the only one who had any potential to try and hurt any of us. The hypnosis revealed a much earlier memory when I was around 7 and living in the aforementioned cold state. I remember standing in the snow in the middle of the night. It wasn't cold, but I was barefoot, and I saw a woman in a red dress. She was one of them, big head, scary eyes, and was taller than the rest, and I felt safe with her, like a friendly mum or family vibe. There were other people out in that snow too. Some were walking somewhere, I don't know if they were going very far, and there were ships in the distance. There's a specific feeling I get even now which reminds me of exactly that feeling of standing in the snow, when my body is warm but the air all around is cold and dark, like familiar and comfortable but lonely and isolating, like warm and cold at the same time. The second time I saw them, I was still living in a very warm southern state in a different house with a different stepdad. This one was actually amazing. I found myself waking up sitting on the floor in our kitchen across from Helen Hunt, the actor, at the time. Mad About You was pretty popular and I had a bit of a crush on her, you see. I was confused because I woke up sitting cross-legged and also Helen Hunt was smiling, sitting a foot away. "You don't really look like this, do you?" she said. "No, but I thought you would be more pleasant than you." I noticed around the corner in the other room, hiding behind a chair, there was one of the aliens. I felt that I was angry, so I asked her what her deal was, and she told me not to worry about them, that they were just jealous of people. I didn't understand what that was supposed to mean other than be dismissive. The fake Helen Hunt made me feel safe. I figured she went out of her way to look for this, and to make it more pleasant for me, so that others may show concerns for my feelings. Maybe they can't all be bad. I felt like she was protecting me from the scarier ones, but they were also present. But she seemed like she was in control. My paranoia said that they just wanted me to be convinced. And I talked with her some more, but I didn't remember any of it, other than it being a generally pleasant experience, besides how strange it was. There were other small pieces I remember, odd situations that happened around the same time. My sister waking up late one night scared because she saw a light move outside her window. I watched as there were power lines and you could see stars moving back and forth over them, using the wires as reference. I couldn't have seen the satellite, or stars or planes. They were literally dancing around. My sister and I were too scared to sleep, so I told her I'd sleep on the floor to keep her company. I asked her as an adult if she had any memories about them, but she told me she did not. Not even the light incident? There was this odd dream I had been given a task in, which was to catch a fish. Then the dream would repeat itself and give me a slightly different circumstance, like catch a fish but only with a spear this time. It would repeat several times until I would become aware of it. That would break the dream logic and I would wake up. And it happened several times. I would always wake up with the same feeling of dread that happened after, and it always felt like I was related to them. I've had dreams where I was being chased by them, where ships were searching for me with beams while I was in the building, and it's been a pretty consistent theme throughout my life. I've mentioned this in the last one before, but when I was 17 to 18 I was still living at home in the same house from before. At this point it was now the mid-90s. I wake up in bed and saw a bunch of Muppets or puppets throwing a party in my bedroom. They were mostly fuzzy and blue, I think. The light in my room was bright and happy, and I felt like this Muppet show was condensing, and told them I don't believe them and that this is fake. As soon as I said that it was fake, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. The lighting went from happy to dark and dramatic immediately. All of the fuzzy blue Muppets peeled off their masks, revealing big, scary grey aliens. I couldn't tell you how many there were, but I felt like there was a lot of them. A big one floated out of the closet towards me. It didn't walk, it just glided, and I could tell that it was pissed. He talked, or at least I heard him, because I don't remember seeing their mouths. We're trying to make this easier for you, but that's not going to happen now. I was terrified, just crying in bed and sobbing. The big one cradled my head and looked at me, seeing me so scared and upset, then said, "You're not ready yet." Then I woke up in bed in the morning with dry tears on my face. After that night, I haven't seen them again. I feel like I failed a test after the Muppet encounter, since they were testing my fear level or something, I don't know. But I've seen the occasional shadow person run across my house. I've had a dream about them. I've had 1 or 2 incidents where I felt like something was in my house and went around searching closets like a madman at 3 a.m. I'm not saying it was aliens. I've become comfortable with the idea that maybe I hallucinated these things, or maybe there were experimental drugs in school cafeteria lunches. Perhaps it's just vaccine side effects. Who knows? All that I know is that I saw it, and that it was real. A friend and myself were walking home at 3 o'clock in the morning, about 6 kilometers across a small town in New South Wales, Australia, from one friend's place to another, which is where I was living at the time. We were only about 1 kilometer away from home, on about a 500-meter stretch of straight road. We were walking along a sidewalk. He was pushing my BMX, and we were just chatting as we usually did, when all of a sudden something caught my eye. 2 greyhound-looking dogs, but larger than your average dogs in height, probably twice the size. They ran out of a block of flats, or apartments, whatever you call it, then jumped the brick mailboxes on the side of the footpath onto the other side of the road, which stood about 3 to 4 feet high. Both of these dogs landed in the middle of the road, then ran in the opposite direction to which we were walking. As they ran further, they grew larger and larger in size. While they grew larger, they seemed to begin to stand up on their hind legs and morph into some large, muscular Bigfoot or werewolf-looking creature. And in my mind, I could not comprehend what I saw. These creatures ran around the corner in the exact direction we walked from, and about 5 to 10 seconds after they turned the corner, we heard what sounded like a female child scream. At that point, we both looked at each other, and I could tell he saw what I'd seen, as he was about to haul ass and bail on me on my bike. I said screw that, jumped on the handlebars, and he pedaled, the likes of which I've never seen. I don't think he slipped a pedal for the rest of the trip home. When we got home, we locked the doors and closed the windows, and I asked him to explain exactly what he saw, and to no surprise, it was exactly what I had witnessed. He was an Indigenous Australian, as was his elder brother. We explained the experience to him, and he said that it was probably a yowie, which I believed at the time, but this story is not typical to yowie sightings in Australia. Safe to say, this scared me to go out at night for quite a while. We told a few people about the experience afterwards, but most of the time people would laugh or joke or say that we were on drugs, or brought up hairy man, which is a slang term for yowie, while drinking. But I can assure the people hearing this, the same thing I told them. This experience happened, and we were both completely sober. After the joking and carrying on, I pretty much kept the story to myself, only telling a select few people who want to hear paranormal stories, and I don't try to convince anyone it's real or not. They can decide for themselves, but I know what I saw. I'm 14. My friend Jay is a year younger, and we're both on a mission to find the faith that's right for us. I stayed away from Christianity because I was pretty much forced into going to church when I was younger, did not enjoy it, and my older sister's ex-boyfriend Dylan introduced us to Satanism. In hindsight, should have walked away. He swears it's all about loving yourself, being your own god, and putting your faith in no one but yourself. Okay, I'll bite. Things are good for a few weeks, and then things get weird. He wants to start dragging us to sacrifices and summoning into the mix. So Jay and myself agree that summoning something sounds interesting, but we're adamant about not killing anything. We do the summons, didn't seem like it worked, and later that week, 2 dumbass teenagers started hearing weird sounds and seeing weird stuff in our homes. Obviously that's us. We decided to tag out of this mess and repent. One of Jay's friends goes to a local Baptist church that was having a lock-in, where a large number of kids are locked in a church with some pastors overnight playing basketball and religious-themed games. We decide to go. We arrive early, and that's when it gets weird. The 2 of us are walking through the church on our way, talking with a pastor. We feel the urge to tell him about our misadventures with the ex-boyfriend of my sister. Along the way, I keep hitting cold spots, hearing footsteps and scratching in the rafters. The area we were in only had 1 floor, and we heard whispers too, which Jay heard also. We're getting creeped out, decide not to hunt for the pastor, and just join in on all the other teenage games. Later in the evening, we're playing hide and seek in the church, where one group are the Romans trying to catch the Christians attempting to evade them and to get to the safe room. That's the underground church. We're on the Christians team and everyone is split into smaller groups to make evading easier. Making our way through this dark as hell church, I suddenly have to use the restroom like I've been holding it in for days. Jay was watch for the Romans from just inside the restroom door while I take care of my situation. I finish, flush, wash my hands and glance up at the mirror in front of me and my eyes lock on the reflection. It starts getting darker around the mirror me. I start freaking out. My facial features begin distorting a little bit, and it looks almost demonic. I blink, regain my composure and nope the hell out the restroom and sprint right past Jay, past a group of Romans and straight to the pastor's office. Jay is trailing behind me trying to figure out what happened, found the pastor and demanded to be let out of the building. I didn't say a word about it for a week and never wanted to go back. Recently I told a minister friend about this and he told me that it was a demonic force trying to coax me back. Well, he sure did a crap job, I thought. He then asked me, "Did you go to God?" The answer was no. Well then, the minister friend said, he still won. He didn't go back to God, which is exactly what he wanted. Maybe so, but I found Wicca, and have been fine with that ever since. No demons in sight for now. About 20 years ago, after I graduated high school, I used to run traps to make extra money in the wintertime. Since I was pregnant with my daughter, any sort of extra income was necessary, since trapping is frowned upon oddly. My father had always told me about the creek I trapped in as being quite strange. We would always walk the creek to collect arrowheads and look for other Shawnee relics. So he would tell me stories about the Shawnee Native American tribe and their history and folklore. It was a very special spot to us. So when I began trapping, my father would tell me to respect the wildlife. Do not litter, kill humanely, and do not kill what does not need to be. So I built a great deal of appreciation to life, which led to my career in conservation. The only reason I state these things is to build context as to why I did what I did. About once a week while walking up the creek I would hear whistling, like a human but in random patterns, and that would be along with the smell of sulfur and rotten eggs, which my dad told me was most likely a Bigfoot or skunk ape, and sightings had occurred as long as he could remember in our area. Then one time I was scanning down the tree line with my binoculars to check to see if I had any coyotes or foxes in my traps to save me the walking time. I'd seen a fairly medium-sized tree swaying dramatically a little past the tree line. So I head over there with my firearm, hoping to sneak up on a bobcat or any medium-sized animal that my .22 could end fairly quickly. About 3/4 of the way to the tree line, the swaying stopped, and I didn't see anything, but at least two of whatever it was began whistling and whooping further back in the forest. I continued to head up the creek, and it always stayed somewhat behind me, at a distance but never left. This was fairly interesting. Then one day, sadly, an oil fracking company purchased most of the land. They still gave me permission to trap, but they had a few accidents where the water got so nasty it killed just about everything. It broke my heart to see beavers, muskrats, and some raccoons floating down the creek every time I went. But after they had installed their rigs and cleared some forest, things became a little more hostile. One day running traps, almost all of my traps had been ruined, bent, beaten and broken, and the remaining animals I caught were either stolen, ripped from the trap with one foot or leg still attached, and I even found a coyote that had been messed up bad. Fur torn, broken lower jaw and head beaten in. I felt like this was in retaliation to what the oil company had done, and I was being blamed, but it was still positive. For a few months afterwards, I would go to the store twice a week and buy a variety of apples, pears, and a mixture of meat from the carcasses I had skinned, put it in a basket, and leave it in the forest, hoping whatever it was would get it before anything else. Sometimes the basket would disappear, but always in about 2 days everything was gone. One day, I believe it left me a present in return. Next to where I dropped off the basket, there were 100 or more small sticks stacked very neatly, about 20 acorns and a deer antler. It made me feel happy. I do hope that I did help this creature out in this very sad moment of its life, though it may have been everything but a Bigfoot/skunky, because I've never physically seen it or tracked it in the creeks, but all of my occurrences happened in the woods along the creek, so I really don't know. To this day, 20 years later, I still think of it from time to time. I don't see a people for reason to be afraid of them. It was a sad but positive 2 winter seasons with it. Even if it was an animal I didn't recognize, I hoped I helped it in some way. About 4 to 5 years ago one night, I was at my friend's house jamming and making music. The hours tick by and we're having so much fun. But then the clock strikes 1 a.m. My friend had to go to bed at this point. He had work in the morning, but he wanted to step outside to smoke a final cigarette and chat for a few minutes. I had the next day off. We both go outside and it's snowing very hard as we both live in North Dakota. Minutes go by having a good chat, as a bright blue light shines from the sky, creating a rectangular shape on the ground. It had 6 squares to make up the shape of the rectangle, and flashed 6 times and then was gone. My friend and I both looked at each other knowing we saw the same thing at the same time. He finishes his cigarette saying, "Don't let the aliens get to you tonight," in a joking way, and I laugh about it. He's all creeped out and says goodnight. I start to walk home. It's a very quiet, very eerie kind of calm, and I am only 7 houses down. And I start to feel very uncomfortable, like a huge wave of anxiety was washing over me. It's like something or someone was watching me. I look up at the streetlights, and they're flickering above me. And out of nowhere, that blue light shines on me, flickering, and flashes behind me 6 times. At this point, I stop, dead in my tracks. I can hear a very low subsonic noise that was vibrating, and I brush it off, continuing my walk thinking I'm just tired and need to sleep. I finally approach my house, walking up a set of stairs leading me to my deck. I take out the keys to unlock the door. The light then flashes 6 times onto the street and stays on this time. I'm staring at the light on my street and see a very tall shadow figure emerge from the blue light. It looked like it was walking towards me. Now I'm in panic mode. I'm attempting to unlock the door and it's 12 degrees outside and I can barely feel my fingers. The street lights are flickering as this creature is getting closer. I can hear the snow crushing as it approaches me. The subsonic noise is getting louder and louder, and I finally unlock my door and feel the need to take one last peek at the thing. And I see a very tall grey figure, roughly 7 feet tall with very dark black eyes. And it's just staring right at me only a few feet away. It then lunges at me, making a piercing scream. I get inside, lock my door, running to my room, setting my guitar down and sit on my bed saying to myself that this isn't real. Minutes go by trying to relax and calm myself. The blue light flashes repeatedly in my window, brightening up my room, and something urges me to look out the window. I stand up, open my curtains and the light stops flashing. It's blinding me and I can barely see. And something smacks against my window that looks like a giant hand, and I see the figure staring at me through the window. I black out, waking up the next day having a massive headache, memory loss, body pains, and my ears will ring. Very dazed and confused, having lost track of time. Ever since then, I've been a firm believer, and I'm on the lookout for more. This story happened back in the late 70s, in Samarinda, Borneo, Indonesia. My dad used to work in a lumber mill there, doing lumber mill related work. He told me that this one time, there was a crowd of people gathered around what appeared to be a makeshift cage made by the locals. When he got a look at what was in there, as it was crowded by lots of people, he was surprised and shocked to see a big primate creature standing upright, about 2 meters tall. The hair of the primate was similar to that of an orangutan, and what is even weirder is the primate creature appeared to be crying. So how did the ape end up in there, you may ask? My father asked a local about it, and one of them said that one day a man from the nearby village was missing when hunting. So, of course, the villagers go to the forest in order to try and find him. But during the search, one of them found a huge footstep that was so large it simply couldn't be human. So they split into smaller parties to follow the track, and to their surprise, the missing guy was found on a tall tree, tied up in what appeared to be a nest of primates. So they helped him down, and that's when he told them that he had been taken by an upright standing ape. The villagers got curious, so the next day formed another search party to search for the ape instead. No one really knows how, but my dad said they found it, and that's how it wound up in that cage. My dad doesn't know what happened to the ape, but some of his colleagues said the villagers actually ended its life, to avoid many more potential victims of being taken. The primate creature was allegedly female. The villagers speculated that it took the hunter to make a bride out of him. And that's the end of the story. I know this isn't a usual Bigfoot story, but I still found it compelling and had to share it with you guys. I met a friend roughly over a year ago. He and I became pretty close in terms of friendship. He helped me when I was down and I helped him. Over the course of a few months, he started getting a tad hostile. One day we were hanging out when I think I saw one of his eyes change a bit. Now I'm huge into UFOs and all that, and we were drinking, so I asked him if he was reptilian. He obviously said no, but I kept pushing him as a joke to admit it. We were talking about his supposed constellation, and he said something like, "I don't really want to tell you this," and I pressed him on to tell me. "You have 2 years to live." I obviously was quite confused, and then he says, "Well, not now, starting from next year." I was pretty distraught after that. Then we slowly started growing apart, and even started to diss each other subtly. We stopped talking to each other, and then he vanished from my life. Come to now. I have a cousin who I consider a brother. He is gay, as is the friend I just mentioned, and we grew up together and even had a music group and performed together. One of the new houses he moved into a few years ago was odd and had familiar sigils and the like, along with some odd markings around the house. I noticed from some research I did that they were wards to try and get rid of demons. Over the course of him living there, he tells me dark spirits revisit him often, even when teasing him, literally nearly every night. He would even have conversations with them. I tried to help him with the sigils and things to ward them off, but he mostly didn't want to. We would still always hang out, of course, every now and then. And then he disappeared about a few months ago, and then we decided to hang out again. This was yesterday. He came over, we did our usual shenanigans, and I'm also into quantum theory and started discussing quantum immortality while writing it on a board, when he laughs during one moment, and I can see his ears getting all funny while I'm talking, and he says, "You know you only have about a year left." That's when I lost it. "What did you say?" "I said you only have a year left to live," my cousin replied. "Well, I thought I had a little more than that," I said. He continued laughing, and I kicked him out the house while going off at the same time. All he said was, "You still have some time left. Stop being like that to me." Keep in mind, these two people don't know each other or hang out together or talk. How could they both be saying that? Could it be that they know demons or are possessed? I need some answers, please. Back in 1947, when my grandmother was young, she used to live in a shared piece of land, ejido, located in San Luis Potosí, Mexico. I can't remember the name of the shared land, but it was small and there were barely a few houses on it. One day, she and her mother, my great-grandmother, went to visit a relative that lived near. But before leaving, my grandmother asked her dad to accompany them, but he refused and decided to stay as he was busy with other things. 20 minutes later, as they were walking, they began to hear whistles and strange noises coming from nearby bushes. My great-grandmother told my grandmother that maybe her dad was making those noises because he wanted to scare them. They ignored the noises and arrived to the relative's house. They stayed there for several hours, but decided to leave when it started to get dark. Again, walking in the same road, they began to hear the whistles, but increasingly closer. My grandmother shouted her husband's name, telling him to stop scaring them, that they knew it was him. The whistles stopped, and now they began to hear sounds like a woman who was suffering or screaming. That was enough for them. Then they started running towards the house. While running, they heard screams and whistles even more, and once they arrived, they found my great-grandfather deeply asleep. They awoke him and couldn't understand what just happened. They never heard the whistles or screams again. Years later, I read an article about Bigfoot encounters with people hearing whistles or a woman in distress. Then I thought that perhaps it might have been what was scaring my grandmother. Besides that weird story, they regularly saw the strangest lights in the sky coming down the mountain. They thought they were witches, and my grandma was really scared to go out at night because of it. She and her family saw a lot of strange things that couldn't be explained back in those days. They knew every part of the share land, and even what kind of animals lived there. Here in Mexico, we have tons of old stories regarding giants that were killed by the Aztecs or died during the wars with tribes. But for now, thanks for listening. This happened 4 years ago, but it's something I will never forget. Back in high school, I lived in a house in the suburbs of a city near the edge of a big forest. I was a freshman, and my school organized this marathon for all first-year students. I wanted to prepare myself for the marathon, so I decided to go for a run in the forest with my older brother and a close friend. Since it was mid-autumn, we decided to go a bit early so we could be back home before it got too dark. On your way to the forest, you have to walk a long, pavemented road through a meadow. We had jogged for a good 2 hours with some breaks in between. It started getting dark, so we decided to head home. We were making our way out of the forest when I suddenly saw bright lights through the trees ahead of us. I told my brother, and he said it was probably just someone running with flashlights. But I mean, we've been there for a while, and we haven't met anyone, at least not on the road in the dense forest. My brother and friend brushed it off as nothing to worry about, but something just didn't feel right. I tried to just forget about it and move on. That's when the light started moving around. There were 2 spheres of light turning on and off and suddenly appearing at different locations. I told my brother and friend as they were walking in front of me and weren't paying attention to the blinking lights. We stood there for a moment and tried to see what the lights would do next. At this point, the lights were still a good distance away from us, but they appeared to blink closer every time they turned off. We kind of panicked because we didn't really know what they could be, so we started running towards the long road through the meadow that would lead us back to the city. The lights started getting closer, however, and every time I looked behind me while I was running, I could see the lights getting closer and closer. We finally reached the road and started running like crazy. We just wanted to get out of there. That's when one of the lights came so close to me that I literally almost passed out. I'll describe what it looked like specifically. It was a huge oval sphere, about 4 meters tall, hovering at least 2 meters off the ground, and 2 or 3 meters away from me. The light was blinding, but something about it was both terrifying and beautiful at the same time. It was almost hypnotic, and I felt drawn to the strange object. My brother pulled my arm and told me to run, so I did. We got out eventually and the lights didn't chase us any further. My brother told me it would have been best if we don't talk about this again with anyone, as he believed it could have been an evil spirit and bring bad luck to talk about it. The whole experience is something I'll never forget, as it both terrified and fascinated me. I'm Garrett, a Western Paiute who grew up moving because my dad spent his career in the Forest Service. My original home is one of California's largest Indian reservations. I've been a hunter and overall enjoyed spending my time in the wilderness since I could remember walking. I started hunting big game at 10, without a hunting license until 14, because it was legal on the reservation, while living with my family for the summer until I go back to college in fall. I had the idea, which my dad and brother promptly agreed to go on an 11-mile backpacking trip in high country. We spent the next few hours packing our bags with what we would need for 48 hours, but potentially 72 just to be ready. The next day we drove the 70 miles to the end of the last road in the area and began our hike. Excited to break my boots in and see the lake, I took the lead, and by 4 p.m. we made it to our spot, sitting at 8,000 feet elevation. We swam in the lake to wash the sweat off, and then used the sun to dry off before it got dark. Mind you, we are in the northwestern USA, so at this elevation it could still freeze at night, even in July. It was a peaceful and an awesome place 81 miles from the closest town of 3,000 people, with the nearest city being 181 miles south. After we swam, dried off and ate dinner, I was ready to sleep along with both my dad and my brother. After spending the next hours looking at the satellites orbiting Earth and the stars with the occasional quasars, I was in my hammock drifting off to sleep. However, I didn't get to sleep that night, not even a minute, and I'm glad I didn't. I heard what sounded like 3 people walking on the boulders about 50 yards in front of us, right on the other side of the thicket. I'm 20 years old, 180 pounds and 6'2", along with being a college athlete, so I was cocky at first. I told my dad we have people near us and to be ready. This is a weird place to see anyone, at all, ever. However, passing midnight is something that raised a red flag. He listened to me, but was asleep 5 minutes later, and my brother never woke up. I decided to keep watch. I knew what I heard, so I kept my .38 revolver in my right hand with me, while still in my hammock. It's loaded and prepared for self-defense. All of a sudden, it got real. I heard someone or something charging me from the thicket, so thinking I wouldn't have time to turn on my headlamp, I cocked my revolver and pointed towards the sound. While praying for protection in my head, nothing came out the thicket. It went silent, and again being too scared to sleep, I got up like a dumbass without my boots on to try and find what it was. I didn't find anything, not even tracks. So I got more wood, kept the fire burning and tried to warm up. It was 32 degrees with wet soil, so my feet were freezing. Right as the fire stoked up, I heard what sounded like a man run across the river. I looked over there with my headlamp but didn't see anything. Then I asked myself, who the hell would run across 4 feet of running water up here at night? Just because I felt like I was being watched, I looked back across and this time saw big green eyes and grey-looking skin that was see-through. None of it made sense. It was at least 7 feet tall and didn't look alive, let alone human. So I prayed to the Most High and asked for protection. For the next 3 hours I heard rocks being thrown in the river and never desired to sleep until the next afternoon when I was home. I don't know what it was, but I'm glad I prayed. I don't think my pistol would have helped. I asked my aunt about it, and she said it was most likely a spirit who for some reason was angry, or maybe a more sinister entity created after a war or some kind of violence that took place in the area. I still don't know for sure. I will go further up into the next lake, that's another 13 miles, to see if I can find what's going on. I'm not a religious person or a believer in the paranormal. I know I don't have a mental illness and have never abused drugs, but I'm trying to have an open mind and thought I'd ask those who are more knowledgeable than I in these matters. Normally I forget most of my dreams, or remember only fragments of them. However, I had a lucid dream a year or so ago that was truly terrifying and kind of haunts me. I wish I had forgotten it. I don't want to create a gigantic testament of what it was, so I'll keep to the bare bones of it. I'm on a bus with other people. Outside the bus is the universe, so the bus is traveling through space. There is a severe feeling of loss of time. It is a lucid dream, so being self-aware was painful because I felt dulled to time inside it. I finally managed to get out. As I'm entering a sort of citadel made of nonsensical geometric shapes from the outside. On the inside there's a sort of labyrinth. Not being able to traverse the labyrinth, I wore myself to the center of the citadel. There are lots of mirrors in the central room. None of them reflect my body. In the absolute center is a pale, sickly-looking woman with long black hair holding a child, with some serpent and fish-like features. The woman and the child is reflected by the mirrors, and as I'm walking towards them, they seem completely oblivious to me. But as I get too close, the woman is utterly apathetic to my approach. The child in her arms does see me. Its face turns into a demonic one with cruel eyes, and a mouth with many teeth, like a shark. So it screams an ear-shattering sound, like a hellish screech that quakes the entire citadel. The pale woman cradling the child is still unaffected, as if blind and deaf. The screech is so loud, so terrifying, and the only way I can describe it is soul-piercing and mind-shattering. So at this point, the sheer terror wakes me up. As I'm waking up in real life, I feel unable to move for a bit, as if suffering sleep paralysis. I can't tell if I spent 30 seconds or 3 minutes, but only then did I finally manage to climb out of bed and get up on my feet. I also had some hallucinations of text and colors on the walls. I hear it's normal with sleep paralysis, if that is what I had. But the reason I shared this is because I was looking for answers for a while. This lucid nightmare still haunts me. It's the only nightmare I've ever had in my life that stayed fresh in my mind for so long. The memory of it, the imagery, and the emotional trauma is still as fresh as if it happened yesterday. It's hard to get any real input due to most people not taking dreams seriously. So I wanted to see what you guys thought, if perhaps it could have been something paranormal or demonic. Growing up in northern Idaho, I found the native lore surrounding Sasquatch very compelling because it resonated with the Islamic folklore of jinn that I grew up hearing about from various relatives from the Indian subcontinent. Jinn, like many of the native legends, are shapeshifters and exist mainly in secluded areas of wilderness. They are often associated with strong sulfuric odors, more commonly associated with demons, devils, and the like. And it turns out, countless reports of Bigfoot/Sasquatch too. For an undergraduate project years ago, I interviewed famed cryptozoologist Grover Krantz at WSU. He had analyzed the famous Patterson footage down to a gait in proportion to size, movement, muscle beneath the skin, the infamous torso turn, and of course the apparent breasts. It was fascinating, but not nearly as fascinating as all the anecdotal evidence he received from park rangers, hunters, farmers, and hikers. Krantz explained that most folks almost always bristled at his inquiries about sightings for fear of ridicule. Once Krantz earned their trust and assured them it was for research, he heard some fascinating stories that often defy explanation, including vanishings, mysterious sounds, and impossible happenings. For example, a farmer apparently shot one point blank only to have it disappear on him. The sulfurous stench, of course, was mentioned ad nauseum. Krantz, however, maintained until his death that Bigfoot was some kind of elusive primate and nothing more. Now, if you really want to put on your paranormal hat with me, my own mum told an incredible story when I was around 7 or 8, well before I had any interest in Bigfoot. She said a lady would come to the house on occasion to help cook and clean when my mother was around 10 or 11, while living in rural parts of the Punjab. This particular lady apparently told tales and whatnot, according to my mum anyway. And this lady insisted that she knew of a man who had befriended a jinn. In Islam, jinn have moral agencies just as humans do. As such, many can be good. In Mecca, there is even a mosque dedicated to the jinn. She had begged and begged to meet the fantastical creature, but the man refused, and one day the man finally relented, or so she told my mum. He told her to go into the far room, and there she would meet the creature. Now I know this sounds far-fetched, and is just a late-night tale on Reddit, best met with incredulity. But what the woman saw often makes my hair stand on edge, considering the time, the place, and when my mum casually told it to me in the first place. Again, I was maybe 7 or 8 with really no clue about Bigfoot or jinn. Before running out of the room in a panic, the woman swore she saw a large, darkened creature that almost reached the ceiling covered in hair and had a face oddly like a man. My entire life, I was followed around multiple states from my childhood to adulthood. I'm not sure who or what it was, but it always found me. It seemed to be trying hard to make me extremely uncomfortable. I was a Christian as a kid, and whenever I used religious calls, prayers, and phrases, it would go away for a while. I spent most of my life pretending not to notice anything. Things moving, a weight on my bed next to me, strange sounds when it was quiet. I eventually lost my belief in Judeo-Christianism and was given advice by a pagan friend on how to get rid of it. Most of the advice was a huge lifestyle and personality change. Stay positive, know your power over them, and eliminate unnecessary worry and fear. It worked. It took practice, but it worked completely. She explained to me that religion is usually used in these situations because it is total belief. Belief strengthens intent. But if you have strong intent without belief, it is exactly the same. Either way, my problem was solved for a while. I ended up getting married and having kids. That made things start happening again, in whichever home we lived. I noticed that it was much more difficult to fight negative with positive when there are 5 other people in your home to add to the negative. I can't make them change the way I had to as a young adult. Since then, I've seen signs of activity and immediately turned up my protection a notch. The activity goes away but comes back if I lift my guard down. It's been back and forth, and I've always handled it pretty well. But about a week ago I had my first nightmare in years. My youngest daughter and wife also had nightmares that night. I immediately noticed the signs and took my usual steps to make it go away again. It hasn't been working, and the next night I was in the kitchen late at night and my dog started growling, baring teeth, and had his hair standing on end. He's literally never done this. I've had him for 7 months and never heard him growl unless he's playing with a toy with our other dog. The same night when I was putting my daughter to sleep, she looked over to the window, glared and then grabbed onto me and squeezed. She kept trying to sneak peeks back over there. The blinds were drawn and the windows were closed. This was the 3rd time that day that I saw her staring at nothing, confused and scared. She's been falling over a lot more lately, sometimes bruising herself. Last night, I told my wife about these signs and asked her to try and stay positive. Stop stressing so much, the basics. This is not the first time we've had these conversations, and she agreed and understood. We went to sleep and I slept horribly. My wife told me about half hour ago that at 2 a.m.-ish, my daughter was sleeping on our bed at the foot, which she doesn't usually do because she loves to snuggle, and she started screaming horribly. She wasn't moving any part of her body, like it was being held still for her. Her eyes were wide open and she was just screaming bloody murder. I'm at work, but my first instinct is to haul ass home and confront it like I have done in the past. But I'm not in the right state to do so, and I'm just too angry, and that'll only feed it. My real problem is, I think I've passed a piece of it to my daughter, like a GD virus. The techniques I've been using for 7 years aren't working anymore, and I don't know what to do. I have 2 teenagers and a very stressed out wife. The negativity in my house is off the charts, and if anyone has any advice, I'd certainly appreciate it. I've shared this story with many of my friends and people that are interested in the unknown. This happened to me and my family back in 2001. I was about 10 years old at the time. We lived in a small rural town pronounced Ulladulla on the south coast of Australia. This is a quiet town for beachgoers, fishermen, and people on holidays from the city, as well as plenty of retirees. Nothing exciting happens here. It's the same monotonous day to the same life that never changes. We were celebrating my grandmother's birthday at her and my grandfather's house one night. They lived at the backside of the town on a rurally typed setting, paddocks, cows, older style homes, with acres of land and lots of bush on a road called Slaughterhouse Road. This is where the local slaughterhouse used to be, hence the name. My grandparents were Italian, so food was in abundance. Parents chatting about how good the seafood was, just your usual Italian birthday celebration. Being so young, late nights seemed distant for my 2 brothers, sister and I, so my mother decided that we could call it a night and head home, as it was 9 p.m. and past our bedtime. As we said our goodbyes, we loaded into the car one by one. I called dibs on the front seat, which I kind of regret. My mother was the last to jump in. In the meantime, I was grabbing the top end of my seatbelt to strap in for the ride home, when I had caught some movement from outside the car window no further than about 8 feet or so away. We were parked in front of the garage, where I saw this thing right where the brickwork ended. It led into the paddocks at the back of the property. I was put into a state of confusion mixed with shock at exactly what I was looking at. Humanoid in appearance, this thing crawled on all 4 appendages, slowly moving out of sight. As it crept past the side of the garage, I say it was about 6 feet long, thin and malnourished, with its bones pushing against its skin. The texture of the skin was like polished leather, pale white, grey and slimy in appearance. As it crawled, the shoulder blades protruded up, like when you see a cheetah on the way it walks around. No tail. Its head was just out of view, as it had already passed before I got a glimpse of it. My stomach churned as the hairs stuck from my skin. My first reaction was to turn to my mother for safety and reassurance that my eyes had been deceiving me. And as I turn around for reassurance, I see this furthest thing away from it. Her face was pale, drained of all color and expression. I waited for any sense of normality to return to the situation when she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Lock the doors." My 2 brothers and sister and I did the same thing, slammed the doors and put the lock down. The car was quickly flung into reverse, and we were backing out the driveway like we were recreating a stunt drive from a Hollywood movie. As we turned down the dark, narrow, bush-covered streets to head home, I still needed that reassurance. I asked my mother what that was. She hesitated and just said, "I'm sure it's just a dog. There are a few scrap rods around here. I'm sure it's just one of the guard dogs that gotten loose." I knew what she had seen, but took the most plausible excuse to calm myself down. Years later, as I got older, I revisited that night with my mother and asked her if she remembered that night outside of Grandma's house, and claimed it wasn't a big dog. She looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "No, darling, I told you kids so that you wouldn't be scared. I'm 28 years old and still remember that night like it happened yesterday." I reignite my memory of it every time a friend or new acquaintance asks about scary stories. I smile and say, "You think that's scary? Wait till you hear this." My name is Avi. When I was 6 years old, I lived in a small town in western Washington state. The city is very close to forest area and the population is mostly backwoods country type. In the year 1998, I was living in town. A night came where something strange and unique happened. My child mind couldn't fully grasp what was happening, but neither could the adults who witnessed it. My parents, my grandparents, my uncle, who's a police officer, and all of our neighbors witnessed a large number of floating, flying green balls of light. They were around softball size, maybe a little bigger. My mother has reminisced in the night and told me about how they chased my grandmother up the street and would pace the local traffic. A family friend admitted to seeing them in the nearby highway that night. My family has a very religious background, so their thoughts were that this was sinister and evil. But my memory is different. I vividly remember the green balls connecting in lines of 5 or so and just spinning around like a baton, and then unlinking to fly freely again. They would hover just above the street, up around the street lights and just everywhere in between. My mother kept ushering my brother and I inside out of fear, but I was not afraid. This may have been because I was young and unconditioned, but the lights didn't seem dangerous to me. There must have been at least 100 of them. I have theories about them, but I've never been able to find any other encounters, so this is my newest attempt. I've even put up local flyers with my email to try and get anonymous stories. People in that area just don't like to talk about this stuff. To the credit of my religious family, they did seem to cause the lights to leave. I remember the last of the one I saw was my grandmother, who was praying and telling them to leave. Then suddenly all at once they shot up into the sky and vanished forever. I have waited to see them again ever since. I'm 27 now and I'm still left wondering what they are. My main theory is extraterrestrial. My mother supplements this because she remembers seeing a large craft with spinning lights on it in the sky. And I have actually dreamt this as an adult. Please, if anyone you know or you have seen these lights or anything like it, I would find a lot of peace in knowing that my little hometown is not alone. I live with my dad, sister and cousin. My cousin is male and 16 years old, and for some reason decided to summon some demons for wealth, good mental health and one thing or another. This was about a year and a half ago, and I was completely unaware of this until he started talking about some weird dreams he'd been having. He then described all the exact details of the dream, beside being in different locations of the house that I had a few nights before, and that's when I got really worried. Here's the dream. So I start in the dream in my room, which is at the top level of my 3-story house. And I have an impending doom feeling, so I look down to my stairs and there it is. A dark shadow standing halfway down them, so I run at it, trying to run past it to get downstairs. And for some reason I stop right in front of it, feeling the worst burning inside, an impending doom feeling I've ever experienced. And it just morphs into a dark shadow cat. Then I kind of snap out of it and start running to the basement of the house, all while it's following me. I get to my dad's room and start beating on the door and screaming, trying to get him to open it. And everything just slowly starts to lose sound as the cat comes closer, and I'm screaming but no sound comes out. Then I woke myself up from a whimpering type scream, and my cousin said he had the exact same dream, but it started at his room, which is the basement as well. The shadow person morphs. He beats on my dad's door and the cat rubs against his leg and he wakes up. If that wasn't strange enough on its own, he has started to hear voices calling his name, getting closer and louder each time, telling him to wake up, even when he's at school and away from home. And today he went to walk to the buses and there was a humanish shadow figure standing near a barn, accompanied by the sound of thumping that got louder and louder. He said he tries to call out to it, but it wouldn't respond, and it set off the motion detector lights at the barn, and it just still remained a dark, shadowy figure. The thumping continued to get louder, until it just stopped, and the figure just disappeared. That has been pretty much how it's been for a while. I have other odd experiences as well, but my question is, does anyone know what it is? And if there's any way that I can protect myself from it, or make it go away. I remember this story as clearly as the day my father told it to me. He's no longer with us. He passed away January 15th, 2019. But he and I spoke about this several times. But the first time he told me is the one that remains. He was what they call a pathfinder in Vietnam, and had the uncanny ability to blend into his environment like a chameleon. He was helping a friend who had gotten a piece of land in the wilds of Alaska for homesteading. He said he observed this creature, this giant, for about 15 minutes. My dad was 5'10", and he estimated this giant to be 15 feet tall. He said it was fair-skinned with a long beard and had bear skins on his chest and shoulders, and deer or moose skins on his lower half. He said the giant had very crude shoes of fur as well. What struck me as crazy was the fact that my dad said the giant was whistling. Then it made a deep grunt sound and 2 wolves appeared, and they hunted together like a pack. He said they disappeared soon after getting a nice deer. He couldn't believe what he'd seen. He told his friend, and they went to the local tribal grounds and asked around and found out that many hunters had seen them. They think maybe it was a family, because a few men claimed to see a female about 12 to 13 feet tall and a smaller one with her. It amazed me and I have researched a lot into different cultures to see if there was giant lore, and it seems that it's mostly in colder climates. In regards to why they're not very often seen, there are very few of them. They are seen every few years or tracks are found, and these are almost always in enormous wilderness areas where there are no people to see them 99% of the time. They don't live near civilized areas the way Bigfoot will, so they are just not frequently spotted by us as a result. It is also likely they're far more intelligent than Bigfoot. Evidence the occasional sightings, with one carrying a sack or basket, footwear, goat-hide clothing, and Stone Age-type weapons. Not all of them are this bright, according to the stories, but they could sure avoid us quite easily, especially with their ability to move large distances and across difficult terrain swiftly. My family have some land on a remotish mountain just outside of Eureka. I come down here a few times every year and haven't really experienced anything too out of the ordinary, but last night was different to say the least. I didn't know this before, but apparently my area is pretty popular for UFO sightings. I still don't know if that's what this was, but I'm having a really hard time coming up with a logical explanation. We had a good fire going for a few hours, and after everyone else went to bed, it was just my dad, fiance, and I left. We were all just talking and enjoying the cozy weather and fire, when around 1 a.m. we started talking about constellations, so we'd all leaned back and were staring up at the sky. My fiance pointed out a light that was noticeably brighter than the stars, and it was steadily moving. I immediately figured it was a satellite, but then my dad chimed in with a, "Oh no, I don't think it's that. Watch for a second." My dad and I are hugely into aliens, and we both have had a fair amount of sightings in the past. I focused closer on the light and saw it. It wasn't just gliding across in a straight line, it was zigzagging back and forth as it was moving east. The three of us were exclaiming about how weird it was, when it suddenly veered in an arc towards the southern mountain. I'm thinking to myself, okay, is this really happening right now? And the light just stops. It just hovers above the mountain for at least 5 minutes. At this point, we're all saying that it's definitely not a satellite, with the occasional comment like, "Holy shit, this is weird." The light started to shift to the right again until it was behind a tree, and we lost sight of it completely. We went back to the normal campfire shenanigans for a few minutes, and my fiancé got up to get some drinks. As soon as he got up, the entire sky lit up in an almost painful bright white flash, like lightning on steroids. This was a crystal clear night. There wasn't a storm on the radar for miles and miles. We couldn't even see one little wispy cloud. It absolutely could not have been lightning. My dad and I were the only ones who saw it, as most people were asleep and my fiancé was inside. There wasn't a single sound when it happened, no boom, no rumble, but the entire mountain went dead silent for a few minutes afterwards. It was so eerie. It's like time around us paused momentarily. My dad ended up feeling so uncomfortable and anxious after that he just went back to bed. The two of us stayed up for a while after that, but we didn't see any more weird lights nor flashes, but I definitely felt a heavy sense of unease around us for the rest of the night. I have a pretty creepy story to share with you, and although I never saw a UFO, I saw an entity mostly associated with them. I grew up in the USSR, in now northern Belarus, until I was 13. 37 years ago, my mother and I saw an entity outside looking at us through the window. It was hairless, pale white, huge bulging black eyes, and it had teeth that were very small, very well spaced. It was skinny and pointed, almost like an anglerfish. We hid for hours until we heard my father drive towards the house. We both looked out the window to see the being standing up from behind a wall. It was much taller than a human, hiding behind that wall, and I believe it was waiting for us to come out. My father came up the driveway. We saw the silhouette of its body from the back. It was hunched over, staring at the car. My father saw in the headlights what it looked like perfectly. He drove at it and it ran into the brush around the house. It never made a sound. It seemed smart and cautious, and the overwhelming feeling I got that night was that it was vicious and violent. My parents spoke with police and were so horrified about the encounter. And after speaking with them or KGB, we were relocated and forced to never speak of the event to anyone ever again. Within 30 hours, I was living in a new home nearly 100 kilometers away. I've searched for so many years for an explanation. I've spoken with government officials in Belarus. I have interviewed with people who lived near our home about 10 years ago, yet I have no answers. If people might speak with me via messages, feel free. I seriously want to get to the bottom of this. When I was a preteen, we had 3 TVs. One on the TV stand that stopped working and 2 on the floor. One which worked and the other one was for the camera we had pointed at the outside door to see who was outside it. You can probably guess why my parents did that, but it's not really relevant to explain why the 3rd TV. One night I was home by myself reading. The lights were on, and since this is a single mobile home, basically the kitchen and living room were one room, and just had one tile and the other had carpet. So when I looked into the reflection of the TV on the stand, I could see the kitchen and living room. Now looking into the reflection, I saw a shadow just floating by the ceiling in the kitchen. My dad did have an old WB frog hanging from the ceiling, but when I tapped it and looked into the reflection, I saw the frog moving. But the shadow was staying still. It was just hovering there. All I know is that it was dark. I couldn't see through it and it was bald, like there was no hair. This pitch black figure. I sat on the couch staring at the reflection since I couldn't find what was causing it and thought I was going crazy. When my parents got home, I had my stepmom look at what I saw, and while we were both looking at it, me seeing what I saw the whole time. She was a beautiful angel with flowing hair smiling at her. We saw 2 completely different images. My dad didn't see it at all. Since they had brought home food, I had looked away and couldn't see it again after that, although somehow that TV started working again. I do have to say my home did feel very oppressive at all times. My father was always angry, and while he was never physical with me, he scared me. My stepmom was always emotional, and there were times when there was fighting, and she would threaten to end her own life. I spent as much time as I could away from home, until I wound up moving in with my grandmother. Did we see a demon provoking our family? I used to live on a large property with a lake, 29 acres of land and heavily forested. I was playing, and was about 11 or 12 at the time, outside by myself, right when the sun was setting. It was fall, and there were barely any lights outside, except maybe for a light on the house about 50 feet away from the playset that I was on. Behind the playset were really tall trees, and not many new sapling trees anywhere near, because we had been clearing them out. I know specifically that there were no trees short enough to have some owl or animal sit on, because all the pine trees were mature and taller than my 2-story house. My mum came out to tell me that dinner was almost ready. When she did this, she turned on the outside light on the back porch, illuminating the area so I could see. I was on the swing set at the time. I started to get up, and I turn around, and I think to find my flip-flops, and I see 2 bright eyes reflecting the light outside the light, looking at me about 20 feet away. The eyes were well above any human size and were large, about 7 to 7.5 feet off the ground. I stopped stunned and really scared. I was really familiar with the woods right behind the swing set, and I knew something unnatural was looking at me. I couldn't see the body, but all I saw were the eyes. The eyes looked at me and I tried to get an understanding and thought of a massive humanoid. It was a Bigfoot. Remind you that no animal could have levitated in that spot for 5 seconds, and there were no perches or anything that would suspect critters, not with eyes that size. I ran inside, locked all my doors, and couldn't think straight for the next few days. Let's just say I rarely went outside after that. Just remembering this gives me chills. Back in 2015, I had this experience that made me realize the world is a stranger place than I thought it was. It was around 8 p.m. and I was coming back home from the movies. I dashed my foot against a stone and my body started to run against my will. A supernatural force had hijacked my legs that made me sprint extraordinarily. I finally managed to halt and walk normally after being played with for about 2 kilometers, which is a long way. As I tried to gather some sense of what happened, I saw something unusual in front of me. Near the signpost of an SDA church that I was a member of, there was a glowing shadow, a diabolical silhouette that just appeared, and what made it creepy was that its half was waist downwards, and it had no upper body. I was struck with fright. I knew my mind could not just make up such things, it was real. I started chanting Jesus' name several times, and I approached a stranger by the shops and rhapsodized to him what I'd seen, and requested him to accompany me to our gate. I didn't even see his face because it was so dark. He was not even shocked by my narration. I did not disclose anything to my parents as we had supper, but Dad noticed my unusual stillness. We prayed and departed to sleep, and that is where my nightmares began. I could not catch a wink of sleep. I tried to kill time by reciting an SDA fundamental belief about Jesus and Christians having power over the forces of darkness. This really calmed me down. Then late into the night I felt an ominous presence. The dog outside started barking and flapping its ears, and whenever that happened I got physically attacked by a force so strong that it was pressing down on me, as if it wanted to gain entry into my body. I later thought it was the upper part of the demon that also wanted to inhabit me. I sweated, cried, and prayed under my blankets as I longed for sunrise. It was the longest night ever. The next day I realized that my legs were unusually stiff, and that they could literally just walk up a hill or hop to a spot without me putting effort in. I had been possessed by a half-genie. My cousin had also commented on my unusual speed when I ran. We were together watering cattle at a river when I decided to exorcise the pesky demon. I immersed myself in the water and read out a scripture from my pocket testament. When I reached home, I washed my hands, which were also possessed wrist downwards, and I knew this because I had to hold a pen, and the handwriting was terrible. Whenever I tried to write Holy Spirit, it's almost as if my hand would deny me. I also wetted my lower half, poured the contaminated water and got ready for the genie to be expelled. Not sure if I was stimulating a voice of an angel in my head or if it was real, but I started the process and began convulsing. My thigh muscles contracted severely, so did my hands, and something told me to count to 700, and my frozen hands could be set free. I don't know what could have happened if anybody had busted in during this weird stuff, but when I finished, that was that, and I was very glad to be relieved of whatever the hell that was. This is a story that happened to me in October of 2013 in Brighton, Michigan. Ironically, this happened the night before Halloween. I was 13 and in middle school. It was late, roughly 9 p.m, and was just about completely dark, but it was a full moon. I live on a dirt road that sits right on a golf course, which is in the country club, and was closed that night. Never in my life had I experienced something like this. My sister, myself, and my grandma were all home while my parents were out for the evening. I was sitting watching TV in my living room when all of a sudden, my dog began growling in a very evil way. It was a growl I'd never heard her make before, so it drew my attention. She was staring out the window in the living room. When I walked out to look outside, I saw it. In the dirt road were 3 neon green illuminated balls about the size of softballs. They were hovering mid-air and moving slightly up and down. At first I figured it was the neighbors going for a walk, as they had glow balls of some kind, but as I looked harder, I couldn't see anybody around these illuminated balls. At that point my concern grew even more. After watching them hover in mid-air for a few minutes, they moved forward up the road a bit, but they were still directly in the road in front of my house. All of a sudden, as I'm watching these green glowing balls, all 3 of them hover up in perfect unison. Then out of nowhere they shoot up into the sky at a perfect 75-degree angle. After the first one shot up, the second one did as well, and the third. One right after another. The way these objects shot up into the sky was exactly as if they were put in a completely straight vacuum tube. They didn't wobble or anything, they just shot into the sky, almost like they were sucked into it. I was blown away and didn't know what to think. This couldn't be possible. There's no way it was caused by natural means, because the light from the moon lit up outside enough so that I could see if there were anyone outside doing something like this. But not a person was in sight. All my neighbors were inside for the night, and as I said, the country club was closed, with no cars and nothing there. I immediately ran to grab my sister and told her everything that had just occurred, and we went to switch off every light in the house so if there was anything outside it wouldn't be able to see us. We began watching for 10 to 15 minutes when out of nowhere the 3 balls came flying out of the sky once more. After they landed, they began hovering about 10 feet in the air and were directly on the fairway of the golf course, and at this point, the fairway had been lit up. That's when I see these things hovering in the air, and there not being one person around me. As they were moving, my sister and I were watching very intently. They began approaching our house and road, but never entered the property, and once again they formed a straight line together, and one by one shot up into the sky, and after that we never saw them again. My sister and I did some research to find lots of very similar encounters, and we were very, very much believers for thinking that it might be supernatural or UFO related. Green glowing balls just don't come flying out of nowhere and then shoot up into the sky on a perfect angle. To this day we are just unsure, and most likely will never know the true meaning of what it was that happened that night. My dad once told me about something he saw in the woods near Bethlehem. He grew up there, and there's this wooded area up in a hilly suburb of the town that he and his high school buddies used to mess around in when he was a teen. He told me that at one point he and a buddy, during the day, went exploring in the woods and found what looked like a really weird camp up there with this hole-in-the-ground-like cave. The camp was rough, but I think he mentioned a rock pile that could have been a fire pit. Apparently he and his buddies were exploring the area when he heard scuttling sounds from the cave and turned to see something super pale and humanoid looking at him from further up inside. Like a bald mutant albino is about how he described it. He and the other dude ran their asses off back to my dad's place and never went up there again from what he told me. My dad's mom didn't like the place where my dad had seen whatever that was, but I'm not sure if she knew what my dad had actually seen. As a kid, she always told me to keep away from that particular patch of woods. Now, those woods are just loaded with junkies perhaps, but were they trying to make something up to scare me from going there? I doubt it. Wednesday. My friend told me he's a Satanist. I thought it wasn't a big deal, so I kept going around my day-to-day. Then the day after, I decided, hey, why don't I ask him to summon a demon or something? After he did it, a few minutes later, the name of the person that was the target was written in the corner of my notebook. I know he didn't write it, because I was talking to him the whole time. It just ended up there. We laughed it off, and later in the evening everything was normal. I got home from school and continued with everything. I had trouble falling asleep, but I just blamed it on taking a nap after school. I ended up falling asleep at 2 a.m., sometimes in between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., and something called my name. I know it wasn't my mum because she was asleep when I got up from school, so I don't know who it was. There was another thing that was odd about that moment. When I heard my name, I sat up in my bed and said, "Yes?" I don't know why. I was in a deep sleep and never sit up when someone calls my name. The day after, things were normal, other than what happened in the morning. I talked to my friends about it and most of them said not to worry. When I mentioned it to my Satanist friend, he said, "Don't blame me." I went on with the day, but in band 1 of my sheet musics went from my music stand to the last chair, who went up to give it to the band director. I don't know how she got it. All I know is that strange things are now starting to happen to me.